Welcome back to another Explainer, folks. Today, we're decoding a truly fascinating historical military trap, the 1680 siege of the Aravali Hills. We're going to look really closely at the actual mechanics of a starvation siege. It's basically a masterclass in using geography and logistics to completely dismantle a massive opponent. It's so easy to just think of historical warfare as clashing armies and heroic cavalry charges, right? But the reality, it's often so much more calculating. So we're going to break down exactly how this brilliant tactical maneuver was executed step by step to neutralize an absolutely overwhelming threat. The source material actually kicks things off with this stark, super powerful quote. Mughals were not just killed by swords, but starved and buried in the hills. I mean, that tells us right out of the gate that we are not looking at your standard hand-to-hand combat scenario here. No, this was fundamentally a war of resources, a war of attrition. The text frames the defending leader, Maharana Raj Singh, as the Lion of Mewar, which really highlights the fierce, calculating nature of his strategy. He totally understood that to win, he didn't actually need to outfight the enemy. He just needed to outthink them. Moving right into Section 1, the 1680 Mughal invasion. So our source traces the start of this massive conflict back to the year 1680. That year marks the beginning of Emperor Aurangzeb's vast, sweeping military campaign deep into the Mewar region. Getting this timeline down is absolutely crucial, because it sets the stage for a classic David and Goliath scenario. We've got this monumental clash between a wildly powerful imperial giant on one side and a brilliantly strategic regional defender on the other. The stakes literally couldn't be higher. And get this, gal, the text describes the invading force as an army of millions. Now, whether we take that number as a literal head count or maybe a bit of historical hyperbole to emphasize sheer, overwhelming force, the underlying reality, the complete logistical nightmare, is exactly the same. Just think about it for a second. An army of that size isn't just a formidable fighting force. It's millions of mouths to feed, it's thousands of horses to water, and endless supply wagons to keep moving. That massive size, it's actually a massive vulnerability. And it's that exact weakness that explains why the defending forces totally avoided a direct, open-field battle. Which brings us to Section 2, Maharana's Aravali retreat strategy. This source outlines a brilliant and honestly, utterly ruthless scorched earth response here. Basically, to counter an army of millions, you don't fight them where they're strong, you take away everything they need to survive. So, step 1. The defenders willingly abandoned the open plains. They offered zero resistance. Step 2, they safely evacuated their entire population deep into the rugged Aravali Hills. And step 3, which is really the absolute masterstroke here, they took every single grain of food with them. By pulling all those resources, every crop, every animal out of the plains, the Maharana ensured the invading army would just march forward into a completely barren wasteland. They secured their own people while setting the ultimate bait. Let's look at Section 3, the narrow valley trap. The source paints such a vivid picture of how this psychological trap unfolded. On one side, we've got the invading army, marching super confidently into these narrow valleys, completely, quote, blinded by arrogance. Since they didn't face any resistance on the plains, they probably assumed this was just going to be a walk in the park, right? So they just pushed straight into this treacherous, unfamiliar terrain. But on the flip side, the defending Rajputs weren't running away in panic. Not at all. They were strategically positioned, patiently waiting up in the high ground. They were literally using the sheer, unforgiving geography of the Aravali Hills to funnel this massive, sprawling army into a highly restricted, claustrophobic space. Moving on to Section 4, cutting the supply lines. So, once that massive invading army was drawn deep inside those narrow valleys, boom, the trap violently springs shut. The Maharana's forces silently moved in and blocked every single rear route. They completely severed the enemy's supply lines. Suddenly, the invaders were physically and geographically trapped. And remember what we said earlier? An army that large needs a constant, heavy flow of resources from the rear just to make it through the day. In one swift, brilliantly executed geographical maneuver, that critical lifeline was completely cut. Just like the narrative establishes, the hunter had entirely become the hunted. And the effectiveness of this tactic? It was absolutely devastating. According to the text, Aurangzeb's trapped army quickly became desperate for even a single grain of food. Just imagine the sheer panic setting in. You got millions of soldiers completely stuck in a narrow valley, unable to push forward into the fortified hills, unable to retreat through the blocked passes, and with literally nothing to eat. The brutal environment itself did the heavy lifting of the warfare. The rugged terrain and the total lack of food drained the strength, the morale, and the fighting capacity of the invading force. And the best part? The defenders didn't even need to swing a single sword yet. Which brings us to the climax in Section 5, the final decisive strike. See, it was only when the enemy was completely exhausted, utterly demoralized, and paralyzed by hunger that the defenders finally launched their decisive strike. Was it a fierce attack? Absolutely. But it was an attack against an enemy that had already been defeated by logistics and geography long before that final battle even started. According to the source, the weakened Mughals were put to death right there in those hills, resulting in a staggering total defeat. It perfectly loops back to that opening premise we talked about. They were starved first, and then they were buried. Ultimately, this historical text gives us a fantastic, detailed breakdown of a true starvation siege. It proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that military brilliance very often lies in controlling the environment, rather than just relying on overwhelming force. And that leaves us with a highly compelling question to chew on. What other great historical battles were decided by geography and food supply, rather than just the strength of swords? So the next time you're reading up on a massive historical conflict, look past those raw battlefield numbers and ask yourself, who controlled the grain and who controlled the high ground? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.